Hi everyone, thanks a lot for taking out time today for watching this very first video in this entire video series. Here we will focus upon one of the most important topic nowadays, that is the cloud service provider entitlements or permissions. So you will be hearing from few other folks along the way. So this is the brief agenda I have put together, where we will be looking into some of the cyber security attacks happened on the CSP environment. Then we will try to understand what analyst says about cloud permission model and why least privilege has become the need of the hour. Then we will look into what are the Gartner's recommendations and how to solve the least privilege challenge in the CSP environment. Then we will look into a very high level on some of the very basics of AWS, Azure, and GCP permission model. And from there, we will try to conclude that each of the cloud providers' permission model is way different from each other. At last, we will see what we will intend to do in the next couple of months to speak on several topics around this entitlement area. So this is one of the major data breach happened on AWS in 2019 for Capital one of the largest financial institutions in US. In this breach, millions of records got stolen. So this is how this entire attack traversed. So the firstly, attacker tried to cover their attacks. So that's where they leverage upon the Tor and VPN. The second step was attacker exploited the SSRF vulnerability, and that's how they gotten an access into one of the EC2 instance, which was doing the job of their web application firewall. On this EC2 instance, what Capital One did, they assigned the IAM role, and this IAM role were given or assigned excessive permission. Then with the help of just two permissions, list bucket and sync bucket, attacker managed to steal information of around 100 millions of users. Then they post the confidential information on the GitHub page. This security industry, they analyzed it. At the first instance, both of these permissions shouldn't be assigned to the WAF, and top of it, both of these permissions weren't used for several months in the Capital One environment. So this is the first attack. On the Microsoft Azure side, Palo Alto, they identified the first known vulnerability, they call it Azurescape. A few months back, it existed on the Microsoft Azure container as a service, or in Microsoft Azure, they call it a Azure container instances. Azurescape is a three-step attack. The first step is attacker has to break out from the ACI container. Once they are able to break out, second, they have to gain a administrative privileges over the multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster. So that's where the ACI service is running for multiple Azure customers. The third thing is, so once they are able to take control of the target organization's container, so by executing some sort of a malicious code. In short, using this vulnerability, attacker can gain an access to the containers of the other customers. And once they get into the containers of the other customers, in Microsoft Azure, there is a concept of managed identity. It's very similar like IAM role. So using this managed identity, what you can do, you can assign a permission to access Azure resources, and you don't need any kind of a credentials at all. So here, the permission can be assigned to access a specific set of resources if your organizations are not following a least privilege principle. So what's going to happen? So you might be able to provide an access or a over permissive managed identity permissions to your entire Azure resources. What it means once attacker has gotten an access to your ACI container, they will have an access to all your Azure resources. So this is a little bit about AWS and Azure. So then if we all think about it, the first thought may come to our mind is there shouldn't be any gaps, or let's try to fix all the vulnerabilities. But as a security practitioner, if we start thinking about it, does it sound practical? Answer is no, because the Azure Scape vulnerability, what we talked about, it's happening on the cloud infrastructure environment. And from the customer standpoint, you may not have any kind of access. Ideally, you shouldn't have any kind of access to the underlying infrastructure. So that's where what we believe, that's where this entire security community believes, least privilege has become the need of the hour. And that's where, so all the organizations, even all the countries, they have started talking about assume breach mindset. So let's look at some of the key statistics on the cloud permissions. If we read about it, if you ever read or read the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report 2022, you will see credential theft has become one of the key pathway to your estate. So whether we like it or not, if one day or another day your credential gets stolen, the only way you can minimize the damage is if you follow the least privilege principle. Then if we talk about the permissions, AWS got like 230 plus services, and I think they have more than 10,000 plus permissions. If you start combining AWS, Azure, and GCP, there are more than 21,000 permissions to be understood. If you think about it, for any humans to understand the rationale about each and every permissions, it's almost impossible. And with the ever increase of the services by each and every cloud providers, we really need some sort of a automated approach to understand what all permissions we require and what all permissions we have been using upon. So meanwhile, data breach from cloud, data breach report from IBM, this states that, so for any breach in any of the CSP environment, it can entail up to $4.80 million. So it is a lot higher as compared to any of the breach happen within the on-prem environment. So last but not the least, as per the Gartner report, so they state that more than 95% of the identities in the CSP environment, they typically leverage upon less than 3% of the permissions assigned to them. Then the question comes, how we can tackle this challenge and what organizations can do to achieve the least privilege principle. So that's where the Gartner, they coined a new term in 2020 or 2021, they call it CIEM. CIEM is nothing but, the full form is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. Under this new CIEM industry, so some of the CIEM vendors, they are trying to solve the least privilege challenge. And most of the CIEM vendors at this stage, they primarily focus upon AWS, Azure, and GCP. If you read about CIEM, it works upon a very simple concept. The first concept is you have to onboard your AWS account, organization, Azure tenant subscription, or your GCP organizations or the folders of the project onto the CIEM solution. Once you do that, this CIEM tool helps you to scan the environment and help you to understand what are the different identities exist in each of the CSP environment. And from there, they go further. They will help you to understand what are the different policies or the permissions or the entitlements tied to each and every identities. Next step is CIEM solutions. They try to go through the CloudTrail or a Azure log analytics or a GCP activity logs information. From there, CIEM tools help you to understand what are the different permissions used by each of the entities in last 90 days. So once it is done, these CIEM tools, they provide you a policy fix. Again, you apply this policy fix manually, or you will be able to do it in some sort of a automated fashion. So before we talk about the CIEM, let's try to have a brief look at the cloud provider permission model. So to understand the permission model, so generally in AWS, we will be focusing upon three W's: who, what, and which. It is basically who has what kind of access to which resources or services. In AWS case, who is being referred as principal. Who can be your human user, your programmatic user, or your IAM roles. So what is nothing but it can be read, create, or delete permissions, which is nothing but in AWS, as I mentioned earlier, they have more than 230 plus services. So you can define what all services any AWS entity or principal has an access to. So combining what and which in AWS, they call it IAM policy, and it is one of the most common policy type. Again, we will look into all the different policies within AWS in the future video. So let's look into Azure. In Azure, rather than three W's, we will be looking at four W's: who, what, which, and where. So here, if we talk about who, in Azure, they call it security principal. So there are a few different categories. Again, you will have a users, you will have a application users, and you will have a managed identities. Then in Microsoft Azure, for resources or for services, they call it resource provider. In Microsoft Azure, once you combine what and which, they call it role. Again, if you recall from my previous slide, in AWS, role is one of the identity type or principal. But in Azure, what and which combination is called role. So this is one of the key difference. And then if we talk about GCP, GCP is also being referred as like four W's: who, what, which, and where. In GCP, who is being referred as principal. Again, when we talk about the identities, your identities can exist in the Google workspace or Google identity. So primarily your users and groups. And then you will have a service account. Your generally service account will exist in one of your GCP projects. Then in GCP, you can provide an access to your resources, to your Gmail account or to your Google personal account. And then you will be able to provide an access to your resources to the entire Google domain as well. In GCP, if we combine what and which, they call it role. It's very similar like Microsoft Azure. When we talk about where in GCP, so there are three different places where you can assign the permissions: organization. If you want to assign the permissions across your entire organizations, that's where it comes into picture. Then they have a concept called folder. Folder is nothing but it's more like a organizational unit. So you can assign the permissions to the test OU, to the dev OU, to the app1 OU, or to the finance OU. And then project is nothing but that's where your applications are going to be hosted. So far, if we think about it, what we have learned from the CSP permission model from a very high level, the first thing is the terminologies are quite different for each and every cloud provider. And the way you are going to assign the permissions, the way you are going to scope it is going to be very different. So that's where, so when I was doing a research, so I found it quite hard to understand the permission models of each and every cloud provider. So considering this, so that's where we thought of coming up with this YouTube video series where we are going to cover some of the topics. The first topic we are going to cover is how does the permission model is look like for each of the three major cloud providers. Again, we will cover AWS, Azure, and GCP only, and then we are going to talk about the guardrails provided by each CSPs. Then we will focus upon some of the best practices to configure and assign the permissions in each and every CSPs. Then we will look into some of the cloud native entitlement tools. What are the different tools you can use to understand what are the permissions being assigned to each and every entities, and what are the permissions being used. Then we will go and we will jump into the deep dive for the CIEM sessions. In the CIEM sessions, we will try to pick and choose one of the commonly used CIEM providers. Again, for CIEM, there are no open source tools as per our understanding. So we will choose one of the most commonly used vendors, and then we will look into some of the privilege escalations can happen in three of these cloud providers. Again, some of these topics can be rearranged depending upon how we find it suitable. This entire YouTube video series, we are planning to host it for like another 6 months. And every week we intend to host one video lasting around like 20 to 30 minutes to cover one of these topics. So again, thanks a lot everyone for watching this short video. If you want us to cover any other topic, feel free to put it on the comments, or let us know on LinkedIn or some other social media channel, and we shall be more than happy to cover other topics related to the permissions and entitlements. So thanks a lot everyone for watching this video.